Good morning, and welcome to this service of worship at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson. My name is Helen O'Brien, and I will be your worship associate this morning, along with Nina Tolley. We have a guest speaker in the pulpit today, Howard Tolley. Howard is a professor emeritus at the University of Cincinnati in Cincinnati, Ohio, and a wintertime member here at UUCT. We also have a guest musician this morning. Carolyn Rapp is playing the piano for us so beautifully. The CDC has formally declared that the COVID virus to be endemic throughout the world. Fortunately, the risk level in Pima County remains low, so we at UCCT do not require that masks be worn in worship or in religious education. You are, of course, invited to wear a mask if you are feeling sick or medically vulnerable. We invite you to join us on YouTube on the live stream. At the start of the pandemic, our congregation was very committed to keeping vaccinated and boosted. For all of our sakes, let's maintain that commitment. We have 2 gender-specific designated bathrooms in the foyer just outside the front doors. Behind the AV desk in the center of the room, we have a 3rd bathroom that is inclusive and is wheelchair accessible. As we worship today, let us remain mindful of those desert people who came first to this place and whose land was stolen in successive acts of displacement and genocide. We honor the Ahatam, the Yaqui, the Yavapai, and the Hohokam, as well as other indigenous peoples who we may not be able to name here in southern Arizona. As a congregation, we commit ourselves to upholding each of the 7 Unitarian Universalist core values. These values bind us together into a community as we work to bring out the best in each of us. One of our core values is justice. We endeavor in our personal and communal lives to make our world a more just place. Later in the service, Howard will address how one of our civil institutions intersects with justice.
How gratifying that this seasonal member from Cincinnati has another opportunity, his last, to lead a UUCT worship service. The first slide you see on screen comes from the Equal Justice Initiative calendar to mark an injustice that occurred on this date, January the 5th, in 1923, when a mob of 200 to 300 white men killed an estimated 30 to 40 black men, women, and children while burning the town of Rosewood, Florida to the ground. A white woman had made false accusations of rape against a black resident to conceal her extramarital affair. The next slide shows the EJI calendar, which for this first week of the new year also notes that on January 1st, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation that exempted 4 non-rebelling states, as well as the January 6th, 1959 guilty plea by Richard and Mildred Loving, the interracial couple forced to leave Virginia in order to avoid jail time. The following words of welcome derive from and add to a script that I first learned when I served on the UUCT Worship Associate Committee. Here it goes. At UUCT, we promote diversity and seek to be as inclusive as humanly possible. Whether you are white, brown, black, or an undefinable hue, whether you are single, partnered, LGBTQ+, polyamorous, cis, or transgender, Whether you dropped out of school and do manual labor, or have higher education and employ blue-collar workers. Whether or not you are politically correct, libertarian, socialist or capitalist, Republican or Democrat. Whether you are theist, agnostic, atheist, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, humanist, or pagan. Whether you are able-bodied or disabled. And whether or not I have specifically identified who you really are. We affirm your inherent worth and dignity. You are welcome here. May you be whole.
May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of freedom.
For this morning's call to worship that I'd like you to read along with me as the words appear on the screen. I've chosen an affirmation authored by UU Reverend James Blake back in 1894. Please join me. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Come, let us worship together.
Would you please rise as you are able and sing Enter, Rejoice, and Come In. The words will be on the screen, and we'll begin. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your ears to the song. Open your ears to the song. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open our hearts, everyone. Open your hearts, everyone. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Thank you. Please be seated.
Our earth is strong. It can hold our pain and our joy, our love and our anger. Our shared bowl, which we use for joys and sorrows each week, is strong enough to hold the big rocks, our collective celebrations and mournings, and also the smaller stones that will be added to signify our individual joys and sorrows. I want to stop for a second and remember the great pain in the city of New Orleans this week. We who live in the desert know that water is a life-sustaining and scarce resource. Let us remember those who are walking through our desert right now without access to water. We also bring to mind those who are seeking to provide access to water in the desert, as Howard pours water from a plastic jug similar to the ones used by our ministry partner, No More Deaths. If you have a joy or sorrow to share aloud, I invite you to go to menti.com on your device and put in the code 6172350. I invite you, if you are here in the congregation and you want to do that and need some help, you can talk to Brian, who can help you get those words in. I invite you, those of you here in the sanctuary, to form 2 lines and come to the table and create ripples of hope by putting a stone into the water to symbolize your joy or sorrow. If you're comfortable sharing the space, there's plenty of room for 2 people at once, one on each side of the bowl. Okay, and here's the joys and sorrows that were shared. My 78-year-old uncle fell down some stairs. He's doing pretty well, all things considered. We'll keep him in our thoughts. I am thankful to be a part of this inclusive space. We're glad you're here. Jimmy Carter inspired me, and I'm sad he's now gone. Yes. Blessings to my nephew and his new fiancée. Lots of joy. I can't shake the sadness. There is always something, and I don't even watch the news. I feel for you. Celebrating the joy of miracles. I'm still here after 25 years, after a life-threatening let me try again. Celebrating the joy of miracles. I'm still here after 25 years after a life-threatening flesh-eating bacteria. We're glad you're here.
When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear for my life, for my children's lives maybe, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the place and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. By Wendell Berry.
I neglected to mention in my welcome that there are 2 copies of the Equal Justice Initiative calendar on the shelves right by Nina's artwork over on that side if you want to check out 2024 and 2025 calendars. Next slide, please. By a vote of 8-1 in 1940, the Supreme Court upheld the expulsion of 2 Jehovah's Witness children for refusing to salute the flag like this and to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Later, during World War II, the U.S. flag salute was changed to differ from how the Nazis honored the swastika. A state law threatened the witness children with reform schools and their parents with prosecution for causing juvenile delinquency. Next slide. 3 years later, on behalf of a 6-3 majority, newly appointed Justice Robert Jackson, who subsequently took a leave to prosecute Nazis in Nuremberg, wrote an opinion that overruled the conservative precedent. His legal rationale for upholding the children's First Amendment rights reads for me like a sermon delivered by a minister of our nation's civil religion. Here are selections. The flag salute requires the individual to communicate by word and sign his acceptance of the political ideas it thus bespeaks. Objection to this form of communication, when coerced, is an old one, well known to the framers of the Bill of Rights. To sustain the compulsory flag salute, we are required to say that a Bill of Rights which guards the individual's right to speak his own mind left it open to public authorities to compel him to utter what is not in his mind. The 14th Amendment, as now applied to the states, protects the citizen against the state itself and all its creatures, boards of education not accepted. While it is the 14th Amendment which bears directly upon the state, it is the more specific limiting principles of the First Amendment that finally govern this case. The state can impose any rational restrictions on commercial entities, but freedoms of speech and of press, of assembly and of worship may not be infringed on such slender grounds. They are susceptible of restriction only to prevent the gravest danger. To believe that patriotism will not flourish if patriotic ceremonies are voluntary and spontaneous instead of a compulsory routine is to make an unflattering estimate of the appeal of our institutions to free minds. We think the action of local authorities in compelling the flag salute and pledge transcends constitutional limitations on their power and invades the sphere of intellect and spirit, which is the purpose of the First Amendment to our Constitution to reserve from all official control. Next slide. I would add that in the 1950s, Congress added to the Pledge of Allegiance, originally written in the 1890s, the phrase "one nation under God." And that was not in it at the time Jackson wrote those words. Next slide. In the 1950s, when I attended public schools in New Jersey, every morning in homeroom, we all recited the Lord's Prayer together and took turns reading aloud from the Bible. Please raise your hand if any of you had a similar experience. Am I the only one? Okay. A couple have done so. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court found such religious practices violated the First Amendment Establishment Clause by favoring Christianity. I was Presbyterian at that time. The New York Board of Regents responded by composing a non-denominational 22-year word voluntary prayer for recitation at the start of each school day. It went, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. In 1962, Justice Hugo Black, a former KKK member from Alabama, wrote for a majority that recitation of an official prayer violated the Establishment Clause by favoring religion over non-religion. Next slide. In school, we nevertheless continued the quasi-religious practice of our civil religion, saluting a revered flag while reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, singing national anthems such as the Star-Spangled Banner, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and America the Beautiful, and by taking civics lessons on a sacred text, the U.S. Constitution, with its Bill of Rights commandments that exceeded the biblical 10. Like high priests, U.S. Supreme Court justices have issued binding interpretations of secular scripture. Those rulings have transformed the Republic in ways that have both advanced and retarded our UU values of pluralism, equity, and justice. The nation's founding fathers offered a constitution that was progressive for their era, but deeply flawed in ways that prompted both formal amendments and reinterpretation by the court. The first 10 amendments in 1791, a Bill of Rights, limited the power only of the national government without in any way preventing state governments from establishing religion. They could censor the press, torture those accused of crimes to confess, deny trial by jury, and seize private property. Following the Civil War, Congress drafted the 14th Amendment on behalf of former slaves, and that amendment granted citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil. And further, it declared that all citizens were entitled to, quote, privileges and immunities. And then, for the first time, the 14th Amendment also extended rights to non-citizens and immigrants by providing this: no state shall deny to any person due process or the equal protection of the law. A conservative Supreme Court quickly eviscerated the 14th Amendment's transformative expansion of individual rights in rulings that denied women equal protection, that found virtually no privileges or immunities that citizens could enforce against state governments, and held that the Due Process Clause did not expressly make the Bill of Rights binding on the states. At the end of the 19th century, pro-business justices on the court ruled for the first time that the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause did incorporate just one fundamental value: property rights. thus limiting states' power to regulate business. In addition, the free market justices ruled that corporations as persons had constitutional rights. In the 1930s, the court totally reversed course, with progressive rulings embraced by Unitarians that upheld national New Deal regulation of big business. Over the course of 5 decades, the court, one by one, made selected provisions of the Bill of Rights binding on the states. From 1954 through 1968, the Warren Court made nearly all of the first 10 amendments enforceable. Miranda versus Arizona and other guarantees of rights for those accused of crimes triggered a law and order racist backlash successfully exploited by Richard Nixon in his 1968 presidential campaign. Nixon's 4 court appointees, however, continued making transformative changes. His first appointee, Chief Justice Warren Burger, authored a landmark decision mandating strict separation of church and state, barring taxpayer support for parochial schools. Nixon's second Republican appointee wrote the Roe v. Wade opinion, supported by Burger and his third appointee, a Southern Democrat. Roe denied that the fetus had equal rights as a person and made binding on the states a woman's right to privacy as a fundamental liberty, even though that right is not expressly mentioned in the Bill of Rights. Prior courts had also read into the Constitution other enforceable liberties that our framers had overlooked: the right to travel, to marry, to procreate. Those liberal justices used an evolving standards approach to constitutional interpretation. Today, a new conservative majority, as a means to restore traditional values, applies an originalist approach to constitutional interpretation, with a literal reading of the text as authored by the framers. In an opinion by Justice Scalia, that new conservative majority, for the first time, enforced the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, striking down federal, state, and local gun control laws. Conservative justices narrowed the scope of liberal precedents, such as Miranda, but without ever expressly overruling them. An opinion by the first woman justice, Arizona's Sandra Day O'Connor, narrowed the scope of Roe without ever overruling that precedent. Then, 2 years ago, for the first time ever, a 5-member majority did just that, holding that a prior decision making a new right enforceable against the states had been wrongly decided. Instead of narrowing a woman's right to choose to 15 weeks, as Chief Justice Roberts wanted, the majority, led by Justice Alito, totally overruled any nationwide guarantee, restoring the state's right to regulate pregnancy from conception. In his successful campaign for president, Donald Trump promised more restorative transformation, such as to undo the 14th Amendment guarantees of birthright citizenship and the rights of non-citizens as persons. Those proposed changes would require a constitutional amendment, but his plans for economic deregulation and dismantling of the administrative state would only require a rewriting of constitutional law doctrine crafted by the Supreme Court, starting with the New Deal. He appointed 3 of the current 9 justices who share his free market values and new vacancies are likely to arise during his tenure. The court's composition today, as you can see, radically differs from most of its history. Article 3 of the Constitution establishing the Supreme Court does not specify the number of justices or any qualifications for appointment to unlimited terms subject only to impeachment for misconduct. For most of our history, only white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant men served as justices, with or without a law degree or with any prior judicial experience. The first Catholic justice won appointment in the 1800s, followed by the first Jew in the 1920s. Can anyone name the only Unitarian ever to serve as a Supreme Court justice? Call it out if you do. I'll give you a hint. He also served as a U.S. president. William Howard Taft from Cincinnati. As you can see from this photo of the current 9 justices, the current ethnic composition has dramatically transformed. Although the current pluralistic court is quite diverse, its 9 appointed members are still far from representative of the general electorate. From 2010 until 2017, the 9-member court had 6 Catholics, 3 Jews, and no Protestants. They all have law degrees, and they all have prior judicial experience. Currently, 6 Republicans, 3 Democrats, 4 graduates of Harvard Law, 4 from Yale Law, 1 from Notre Dame. There are 5 men and 4 women. 6 are white, 3 are of color with more humble economic origins. There are 6 Catholics, a hybrid Lutheran Catholic, 1 Jew, and 1 Protestant. While principled justices do not deliberately apply sectarian doctrine when deciding cases, they are inescapably influenced by their personal religious values, as well as by their economic status, race, gender, and political ideology. Nevertheless, Catholic justices do not all vote the same way on the death penalty, nor do the 4 women justices vote together on abortion, nor do the 3 justices of color agree on affirmative action. Their liberal and conservative values explain their profound disagreement. Next slide. This liberal congregation has prioritized racial justice by embracing the 8th principle. The 2024 amendment to the UUA bylaws states, quote, "We commit to being an association of congregations that empowers and enhances everyone's participation, especially those with historically marginalized identities." In 1938, the court made clear that laws which burdened discrete and insular minorities would be presumed unconstitutional and subjected to strict scrutiny. The court asserted its special responsibility to protect marginalized groups that had suffered a history of discrimination and were unable to defend themselves in the political arena. In the 1940s, the court affirmed that laws which treated persons differently based on race were suspect classifications, presumably unconstitutional unless justified by a compelling state interest and that used the least restrictive means. The counter-majoritarian court crafted a minority rights theology based on the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause by allowing equitable, race-conscious remedies for historic oppression. After finding official acts of intentional race discrimination, judges have the equitable power to order race-conscious remedies, affirmative action to integrate schools, and to create election districts that assured minority representation. In addition, the court allowed government officials and private entities to achieve equity and diversity by use of race-conscious affirmative action. The current court majority, however, has now invalidated such affirmative action as a form of reverse discrimination that unjustly disadvantages individuals with no personal history of racist discrimination. Like beauty, the values of equity and justice are in the eye of the beholder. Chief Justice Roberts has led majorities that systematically proceeded to eliminate race-conscious policies intended to remedy historic discrimination, insisting that the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause requires a colorblind approach. The conservative majority found that key enforcement provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act were no longer needed given the successful increase in minority representation, found that politicians creating gerrymandered districts, reducing minority representation, could do so if the intent was to benefit a political party rather than to benefit the white majority, found that school boards, which deliberately sought to integrate schools by creating multiracial school districts, had violated the Equal Protection Clause, and found, as you see in the cartoon, that university admission policies cannot prioritize racial diversity. Unlike other admission preferences for alumni children and for children of large donors, only those based on race are subject to strict scrutiny and presumed unconstitutional. Chief Justice Roberts, next slide, has also led the court's rejection of Warren Burger's strict approach to separation of church and state by finding that the Equal Protection Clause requires the governments which provide taxpayer support for private schools must also fund those which provide religious instruction. I see no prospect that the U.S. Supreme Court will in the foreseeable future embrace our UU values on racial justice or separation of church and state. Our work to protect racial minorities, to advance our liberal approach to pluralism, achieve equity and justice, should be focused on state constitutions and courts, and on legislators and administrators at all levels. Voters in both Ohio and Arizona restored abortion rights by amending the state constitutions. The court's reactionary turn challenges UUs not only to keep hope alive, but also to keep love at the center. This month, as we honor Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent combat against white supremacy, recall that he preached hate for the sin, but love for the sinner. King's role model, Mahatma Gandhi, led a militant nonviolent campaign that defeated British colonialism while insisting, quote, "Whenever you are confronted with an opponent, conquer him with love. The Gospel according to Matthew reports Jesus preaching, quote, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Abraham Lincoln never demonized secessionists, and he forgave slave owners for their sins. By making love the central UU value, our faith community has retained its core first principle belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all. UUs revile the sins of Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Chief Justice John Roberts, and 3 of their conservative soulmates appointed by Donald Trump. Our core UU values challenges us to combat their sins while practicing tough love for those sinners. It's helpful to know that on questions of free exercise of religion, the extremist conservative justices have firmly supported the rights of minority faith communities. A liberal opinion of Justice Scalia's struck down a Florida law that prevented Santeria worshipers from sacrificing animals in their homes. Justice Alito repudiated a conservative Scalia opinion that had allowed an employer to dismiss Native American workers whose worship practice included use of peyote. Another Alito opinion halted an execution in Texas which had denied a condemned man the right to be attended by a non-Christian spiritual advisor. Those facts might still be insufficient to mitigate the hatred progressives feel for the most wayward, hyper-partisan, corrupt justices intent on overruling the liberal doctrine of the predecessors revered by UUs. Returning hate for hate, just as taking an eye for an eye, violates our core UU commitment to love. History makes clear that the court's edicts in practice may not always become the supreme law of the land. Unavoidable future transformation will cause the pendulum to continue swinging with nonviolent, militant action and loving patience. I hope that our UU values will prevail, even if not in my lifetime. Blessed be.
Excuse me. Let's sing. We're going to sit at the welcome table. Words will be on the screen. If you don't know the tune, you'll catch it hopefully by the second verse, and the choir will lead us. Stand as you are able. We're gonna sit at the welcome table. We're gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, hallelujah. We're gonna sit at the welcome table. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. All kinds of people around that table. All kinds of people around that table one of these days, hallelujah. All kinds of people around that table. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. No fancy style at the welcome table. No repeat that last line, just the last line. Gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. Please be seated. Thank you.
I have been asked to tell a joke before the offering, which, as one of our previous ministers shared, has been shown to make congregations feel more generous. As a man and his family drove home after church, he complained about everything. The music was too loud. The sermon was too long. The church announcements were unclear. The building was hot. The people were unfriendly. He went on and on, complaining about virtually everything. Finally, his observant son said, "Dad, you've got to admit it wasn't a bad show for just $1." Generosity is one of our core values. This church is supported by the voluntary generosity of all who join with us. The offering will now be given and received in grateful appreciation of our shared hopes and responsibilities. We trust that you feel more generous than the man in the joke. The ushers will pass the basket around to receive your donations. If you're online and you want to donate to UUCT, you can also send a check to the office or give online at uuctucson.org/donate. Thank you.
Good morning. This needs to be a little bit higher, but my name is Alicia Clark, and I'm on your board of trustees. I want to first invite everyone to the social hour after the services in Goddard Hall, which is just out the double doors on this side. There'll be coffee, iced tea, lemonade, snacks, and good company. Social hour food and refreshments are free for all, and donations are appreciated to cover our costs. If you're new and want to stay in touch with us, you can fill out the guest information card in the Welcome Center in Goddard Hall, where the snacks will be. You can also find a virtual guest information card on our website in the newcomer section. Beau Anglais' Celebration of Life will be held next Saturday, January 11th at 2 p.m. in Holland Sanctuary. A reception in Goddard, including some tunes from Beau's band, will follow. So thank you, and come talk with me or someone else on the board if you have any questions about what we do or have any comments. I'll be over in the social hall after this meeting.
Grateful for the endless blessings we receive beyond what we could have conceived, for this journey that led us here and this path to follow of a love so dear.
This retired professor couldn't resist offering a lesson. Once upon a time, I taught RE as well. So we have two stories today. The first features these two Unitarian students. In the 1960s, John and Mary Beth Tinker, aged 15 and 13, wore black armbands with the peace symbol to show that they wanted our Air Force to stop dropping bombs in the Vietnam War for a month during the Christmas season. The school suspended them, reasoning that their armbands would disturb classes and keep other children from learning. They appealed to the Supreme Court. A Jewish justice ruled for a majority in their favor. Their anti-war protest was deemed protected, reasoning that the First Amendment guarantees did not stop at the schoolhouse door.
The Supreme Court Counting Book, written by Tessa Dicer, illustrated by Oscar Guevara. Hello! I'm excited to learn more about the United States Supreme Court with you. I am Lucky the Tortoise. Tortoises are an image used frequently at the Supreme Court building. We represent the slow and steady pace of justice. As you look at each page, see if you can find me helping at the court. 1. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States is the highest federal court in the country. It is located in Washington, D.C. Before the Supreme Court's current building was finished in 1935, the court met in several different locations, including the United States Capitol building. 2. Two sides arguing before the court. The court hears arguments or cases involving two different sides, the petitioner and the respondent. Parties before the court can be an individual, a group of people, an organization, or even a state or a country. 3. Three judge panels below. The Supreme Court hears cases that were heard first in the Federal Court of Appeals, which decide cases using panels of 3 judges. Parties bring their cases first in the federal trial courts. If they lose at trial, they can appeal or bring their case to the Federal Court of Appeals. If they lose there, they can ask the Supreme Court to hear the case. There are 12 different federal courts of appeals based on geography, and 1 based on the type of case being heard. What circuit do you live in? Can you find it on the map? 4 votes to grant a writ of certiorari. Before the Supreme Court can take a case, it needs to grant a writ of certiorari. A writ is an order from the Supreme Court to the lower court to send the case record to the Supreme Court for further review. 5 justices to decide a case. It takes a vote of 5 justices to declare one side the winner. Typically, one justice will write something called an opinion, which explains the court's decision. The justices who disagree with the decision also write an explanation called a dissent. Often all the justices agree on how to decide a case. 6 original justices on the Supreme Court. The number of justices on the Supreme Court has changed 6 times since the first Judiciary Act of 1789. Originally, the number was set at 6. John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. 7 amicus briefs. Amicus is a Latin word meaning friend of the court. People, states, or even organizations that are interested in a case but not directly involved can file an amicus brief to the court telling the court how they think it should decide the case. 8 famous lawgivers. The current Supreme Court building was finished in 1935. The classical architecture includes many symbolic statues or images that represent the ideas of justice or that portray important lawgivers in history. The outside of the building contains 8 images called medallions representing famous lawgivers, philosophers, and advocates. Do you recognize any of these? 9 current justices. Although the original Supreme Court only had 6 justices, since 1869 there have been 9 justices on the court. In 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced a plan to increase the number of justices to as many as 15, but that plan never passed Congress. 10 letters in the word certiorari. For the Supreme Court to hear a case, it must first grant a petition for a writ of certiorari. This is a Latin word that means to be more fully informed.
The end.
How many times did you find Lucky the Tortoise in this book?
One last song that many of you will know. If you will rise as you're able, and let's sing. The words will be on the screen, and there will be at least one of Pete Seeger's verses, so if you don't recognize the verse, sing louder. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Drove Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking that rhythm of highway, I saw above me the endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was saying, this land was made for you
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.